Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second webinar of these three webinar series. My name is Eileen Devine. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the United States in Portland, Oregon. And this is the second webinar where we are focusing on very important, I believe, aspects of the parenting journey when you're parenting a child with FASD. So I want to thank NOFASD Australia for hosting this webinar series. I'm very honored to be asked to be a part of it. And tonight we're going to talk about one of the important elements that I talk quite a bit about with the parents that I work with in my private practice. So if you didn't listen to the first webinar, I work with parents who have kiddos with neurobehavioral conditions. Most of them have kids with diagnosis of FASD. I'm also the parent of a child with FASD, and so I have that lived experience as well. And what I have come to believe is true through that experience and through my own lived experience is that many of us begin on this journey learning about the neurobehavioral model and learning about the neurobehavioral approach. Maybe we've read books, maybe we've been to trainings where we've been able to learn exactly what that approach looks like and means. And then we return to our home and we're filled with hope, we're filled with new understanding, we're starting that paradigm shift and looking at our kids' behaviors in a very different light. And it's still really, really hard. So I know that when I first was looking for answers in terms of how to parent my daughter, in a way that was different than my neurotypical child. I knew that much, that there needed to be something different there, looking for answers. And I learned about the neurobehavioral approach from Diane Malbin. I was all of those things, filled with hope, like really lots of light bulb moments, thinking, oh my gosh, this makes total sense. How come I didn't know this earlier? And then went home and worked very, very hard on implementing what I had learned. And it was really, really difficult. And I thought, oh, if I only had somebody who could support me in this ongoing process of how to implement this model day to day in my parenting. And so that was the reason why I started my private practice. That's exactly what I do with parents. And so when we talk about the neurobehavioral model, which we're going to do really briefly here in a moment, we get through that education piece usually with the parents that I work with, making sure that they understand what that means. And then we really dig into these, what I refer to as the human elements or the human aspects of implementing that model every day, day in and day out. And so you'll have a good sense of what those elements, at least from my perspective, are. But really it comes down to the fact that we're all human and that this is really, really hard work. And so how do we have an understanding of those human elements so that we can be looking for them, so that we can give ourselves grace in those moments when we're not doing this whole neurobehavioral model of parenting as well as we would like to, and so that we can continue to improve and continue to be the parent that we really want to be for our kids. So behavior belongs in the brain. Dr. Ira Chasnoff has written a book, The Mystery of Risk. I would encourage you to read it if you haven't already. And this is the title of one of his chapters in that book. Just this idea that there's no behavior that's not connected to our brain and the way that our brain functions. And that really is the underlying foundation for that neurobehavioral model. I'm going to assume that most folks who are listening in tonight have a basic understanding of what I'm talking about when I talk about this neurobehavioral approach to parenting. I'll go over just a really brief review of what it means. And then I'll give you some resources too that if you want to learn more about that model, that you can certainly go and do that. So the primary characteristics, these are behaviors associated with differences in brain structure and function. So what I talk to parents about is this is our best indication of how someone's brain is working or maybe working very differently. So things like executive functioning, the ability to abstract and think abstractly, learning and memory, their developmental level of functioning. All of those are what we would consider brain tasks, cognitive skills that are necessary for us to navigate our world day in and day out. And so when we have a primary characteristic, the behavioral symptom that shows us that an individual's brain is working very differently, it causes us to pause and think, well, what does this mean, right? What accommodations might be needed here? Secondary behaviors are those behaviors that none of us have trouble identifying. They're very challenging, usually in nature. They're defensive behaviors. There are kids, our loved ones, normal reactions to pain and discomfort, to being misunderstood, to having expectations placed on them day in and day out that they simply can't meet because their brain works differently. The hopeful message is that secondary behaviors are preventable many times. We're not going to be able to prevent them all the time because we simply don't have control over our child's environment all of the time, despite our best intentions. But we can prevent much of the chaos that's happening before we understand this parenting shift, this parenting paradigm. And the frequency and the intensity of these secondary behaviors diminish drastically when we really can implement this model into our parenting. So it develops over time due to a poorness of fit. So environments, the people in those environments, not understanding that this individual brain works differently, that they have a brain-based disability that requires accommodations. So all of that, when I talk with parents about that model, they're like, I get it. That makes total sense. I wish someone had given me this information earlier. This was clearly information that I've been missing about my child. So let's do this. Let's start parenting in this different way. There's a lot of hope there, a lot of enthusiasm. There's really a different understanding that happens. And so that's wonderful. And so we talk about, well, what does this mean in your day-to-day? And so oftentimes I'll meet with parents on a weekly basis or every other week. And when they come back to talk to me about how that went, what happened with their child, what happened in their relationship with their child, what does that mean from this neurobehavioral perspective? We come back to what you see here. Their values, and we all have them, their child's behavior, oftentimes challenging behavior, and our emotional response to those behaviors, right? This is where that human aspect of just simply being human comes into play. And if we don't recognize that at play, and we don't do kind of our own work to understand what that means, then we're going to be missing a big chunk of how to really make this paradigm shift stick and be able to sustain this different way of parenting. So before we get into this, the value clashes, our emotional response, what does that all mean? I want to just acknowledge that it is as hard as you think it is, okay? And to remember that curiosity about what you're experiencing, about what your child's behavior is communicating, is so critically important here. So in the first webinar, we talked about these really difficult emotions that kind of come up for us as a parent of a child with FASD, and all the reasons why, and how oftentimes, because our body is trying to protect us, we want to do anything but acknowledge and engage with those emotions. And there's lots of really important reasons why we need to actually lean into them and be more curious about them, engage with that emotion. When we ask something to become, when we're curious about something, we're asking it to get bigger, right? That very thing that we usually want to kind of bury or ignore or do anything to get rid of, we're now taking a step back. We're saying, I wonder what that is about. I wonder why my child had a meltdown in the middle of the grocery store today. Didn't see that coming. I wonder what that's about. And when we can become more curious about it, usually that shame and that criticism of ourselves or our child kind of falls to the wayside. So keeping these two things in mind at the same time, I think, is a really important part of our parenting journey. So what are our values? I said we all have them. They're deeply held beliefs about what is good, what is right, and what is appropriate. So if you think about the secondary behaviors that many of our children demonstrate on a pretty frequent basis, many of those behaviors we don't believe are good, we don't believe they're right, and we don't believe they're appropriate, right? That's our first reaction to them. And so you can already see when we have values that are in conflict with that behavior, how we might have these visceral reactions that we need to be able to identify and maybe take a step back from to be curious about. Our values are derived from lots of different places. One of the things that I hear most frequently from the parents I work with is, oh, this is just so hard. This is not at all how I was raised. My mother or my father would never do it this way, right? And so we're looking at our values, our parental beliefs, and a lot of that is about how we were raised, how we believe the world should work, and our role as a parent should work in our child's life. Beliefs, internal feelings that something is true, even if that belief may be unproven or seen as irrational. And the reason why I want to make sure you hear that is because of that piece about it being unproven or seen as irrational. So even when we have beliefs that are seen as irrational, and sometimes we can even see that they're irrational, we still hold on to them for dear life, right? And if we're not able to understand, like, take that time to reflect and think, why do I believe this? Is this really what I think? Is this really as big of a deal as I'm clearly making it out to be? Then it will continuously trip us up in our neurobehavioral parenting journey. So let's talk about then, where do those knee-jerk visceral reactions to our child's behavior come from? Those emotions that we all feel, right? It's part of this human experience. And what can we do to kind of get a handle on those, forgive ourselves when we feel like we didn't do it quite right, and be able to use that information to get better? I tell parents that this neurobehavioral parenting journey, again, it makes sense intellectually, but the steep learning curve is when you put it into practice, and you're on that steep learning curve for quite a while, right? Especially if you don't have support, especially if you don't have someone who can help you kind of process through and give you perspective that maybe you're having difficulty getting. And so just knowing that you are on a steep learning curve, and as I said before, it is as hard as you think it is, right? This is not easy. And so recognizing, well, why is this so difficult for me? Why do I have this strong emotion is an important part of the piece. So I want to give some examples of the ways that I hear parents talk about their parenting experience, their interactions with their child. And when I'm listening to them, I'm always listening for the values clashes, because again, having someone be able to kind of bring that to the surface so that we can talk more about it and understand the feelings behind it is how you move forward in this process. So the sounds of our values playing into our parenting. When we have things like stop arguing and asking why, because I'm the parent, that's why, right? That value of being the authority, needing to be in charge at all times, needing to be in control, and only having to answer our child once. I should only have to tell you once, right? So we know that many of our kiddos, for lots of reasons, maybe because of their difficulty with memory and learning, maybe because of their difficulty with processing verbal information, their processing speed, maybe they're stuck, that executive functioning, stuck in a verbal or a behavioral loop. They ask a question over and over and over and over again. If we don't understand that that's a primary characteristic of their disability, then our values might get in the way, where we can understandably lose our patience and say, I should only have to tell you once. You need to look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you. This was actually one that I had personal experience with. When I was at the very beginning stages of my parenting journey with my daughter Maya, who has FASD, I was fortunate enough to go to Diane Malbin's workshop, where it was very life-changing. Learned about the neurobehavioral, heard about that for the first time ever. And I said to her at a break, she said during the training, Some kids with FASD cannot look you in the eyes because it's too overstimulating for them, especially if they know that they're in trouble. They're trying to emotionally regulate, and they cannot also look you in the eyes. It's too sensory overload. And I had done this with my daughter. And so I said to her at a break, I am so glad you told me that. I had no idea. I feel awful that I was asking her to do something that she can't do. So I'm not going to do that ever again. But can I just say to her, are you listening? Maya, do you hear me? Are you listening? And Diane said to me, do you have any reason to believe there's something wrong with her hearing? And I said, no. And she said, well, is there a reason why you need that confirmation from her? Is it something that maybe you can either let go in that moment, not need that parental authority to be recognized either by eye contact or verbal confirmation? Or can you just wait to have that conversation if she's clearly not able to manage that? You're 12, you should know better, right? So even when we understand this idea of dismaturity, that developmental gap between chronological age and developmental age that's present for every single one of our kiddos in one form or another, we can still fall prey to this, right? You should know better. You're this age, you're that age. Kids this age don't do that anymore. You need to act your age. Act your age and take some responsibilities for your actions. So lots of times when I'm working with parents, we have this value of responsibility that really comes up for us and is quite triggering and quite emotional for us. There is nothing wrong with wanting to teach our child the value of responsibility. I don't think anyone would argue with that. That's a very wonderful and worthwhile value to spend time talking with our kids about and teaching them about. Where it becomes a clash with this neurobehavioral model is when our idea of what responsibility means at a certain chronological age is in conflict with where our child is developmentally, right? So teaching them responsibility, but in a way that matches their developmental age, would be in line with that neurobehavioral model. What do you mean you can't do it today? You did this perfectly yesterday. So we know that kids with FASD have on and off days, right? Where they can do something one day and they cannot for the life of them do it the next day. If we don't understand that, then we can have that value of, are they trying to manipulate me? Are they just trying to pull one over on me? They did it yesterday. I know they should be able to do it today. And I talked in the first webinar how this is also the path to burnout, right? If we don't understand that our kids have on and off days and able to integrate that into this neurobehavioral model of parenting that we're carrying out day after day, it's the perfect recipe for burnout. I've told you what I expect a million times now and do not want to have to tell you again. Okay, some of the similar primary characteristics that we're not considering when we talk about, when we have these sorts of comments with our kids, and what value is that about, right? I think it comes back to respect. I think it comes back to responsibility, all of those different values. Again, not bad values by any means. We just have to rethink that value in the context of our child and their brain-based disability. Stop doing that, it's inappropriate. You know that, we just talked about this, right? So how many times have you been with your child where you've just gone through trying to get them, either they've been stuck in a behavioral loop, that executive functioning, or they're incredibly impulsive, again, executive functioning, and you've very calmly talked to them about why what they just did, why it was inappropriate, why they can't be doing that. And then you turn around and they're doing it again. Incredibly frustrating, incredibly wearing. There is absolutely justifiable reasons for being frustrated by that, right? And having that wear on you. And also, if we don't have the ability to take that step back and understand this is a primary characteristic at play, this is a part of their disability, they're not just trying to trigger me, push my buttons, They need to be retaught over and over and over again. Then it will lead us on that path to burnout. And I think this is the last one. Sit down now and listen to me. We are not going anywhere until we talk about this. So how many times has your child done something that's been unacceptable? There's been some emotion involved in our reaction to that, either due to safety concerns or just because it was something that we found very wrong or highly inappropriate. We wanted to extinguish that behavior immediately in whatever way we were able to do that. And so we have this response. Well, at this point, they know they're in trouble. They may have great difficulty with emotional regulation. Many of our kiddos do. That's an executive functioning skill, even at older ages. And so their ability to sit still and listen to us and emotionally regulate all at the same time is going to be nearly impossible, right? And so if we were in our very perfect neurobehavioral parenting mindset, we would recognize all those factors at play. But because we are kind of amped up a bit as well, maybe not as regulated as we'd like to be, it's really difficult to keep that value in check with the behavior that we're seeing and try to reduce that clash that we often see between them. So the dismaturity that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that term, that gap between chronological age and developmental age, incredibly important when we're talking about our values, our emotional response to behaviors, and what happens in this neurobehavioral parenting experience when that all comes into play. Dismaturity, I talked about this in the first webinar as one of the things that I think is most difficult at times for parents to remember, since many of our children look so neurotypical. It's really, really tough for us to keep at the forefront of our mind. Again, understandably, we are all human. And it also brings a lot of fear and a lot of sadness, right? And so that makes, I believe, our emotional reaction to the dismaturity clashes with our values even that much greater. So if we have a child who's 6, and these are the types of tasks that they're able to carry out without any issue, tying your shoes, playing nice with others, so on and so forth, then everything is right and everything is as it should be. And we're very happy about that. Acting your age at 16, many kids who are 16, young adults, are either working on these tasks that you see here or are working towards them. And again, when that's happening, we're very comfortable as parents. We're very happy. Nothing is clashing with our values. Things are as they should be. When we have dismaturity at play, and our 6-year-old is really a 3-year-old developmentally, that's their actual developmental age, then things on this list are not possible, right? The expectations have been set too high for them. And for many of our kiddos who are 6, but 3 developmentally, they're going to fail to meet those expectations, have secondary behaviors if we don't recognize that we need to adjust those expectations. And we are going to have an emotional reaction to them not meeting that. So tie your shoes, that morning routine, wanting our kids to just get ready independently as we would expect them, as much as we would expect them to at 6. If we don't give them more time, if we don't understand that they don't yet know how to tie their shoes, if we don't understand that they have on and off days where yesterday they were able to do it, but today not only can they not tie their shoes, but we have to help them get dressed with their pants, with their shirt, everything in between, right? Then that's going to lead to that clash, that emotional reaction that's just going to wear us down if we don't recognize it and get a handle on it. Same thing with a 16-year-old who is really 8 developmentally. When you look at this list and think about an 8-year-old, there aren't any of these that make sense any longer, right? But when we have a 16-year-old who we see as a physical 16-year-old who wants to be with 16-year-old peers, but is really 8 developmentally, we can have a really hard time with these things, such as being responsible. What does that mean for a 16-year-old? And the fact that our child is not there yet. What does it mean for independence? What does it mean for their planning for the future, right? So we can start to see them as lazy, not taking initiative, being defiant, not wanting to contribute to the household in the ways that we expect. Again, responsibility, growing independence, planning for the future, all of those are really wonderful values for us to have as parents and instill in our children. But knowing that our child's developmental age is drastically different than their chronological age is that key piece in order for us to, again, keep those emotional reactions to that dismaturity in check and to be able to continue to parent from this neurobehavioral lens, not let that get in the way. So I know this is a really busy slide. I'll stay on it here just for a moment so that you can have a chance to look at it here. But these are some of the primary characteristics, again, the way that a brain functions or functions differently for an individual, in this case with FASD. Some of those primary characteristics, some of the common value clashes or expectation clashes that we have as parents with those particular primary characteristics, how we interpret the behavior that we see when we get stuck in that behavioral lens and we're having a really hard time taking a step back and thinking about it from this brain-based approach. We can interpret it in these different ways at times. The interventions that we leap to, right? So if we are interpreting that as willful, intentional behavior rather than a symptom of the disability, the interventions are going to be based in that behavioral lens mindset. The secondary characteristics that come about for us in these moments and for our child, and then some accommodations that we can consider, that we might consider to kind of help our child settle, and in the process help us kind of get that deep breath, get our regulation in check, and then again get back into that neurobehavioral mindset so that we can move forward with that in mind. So I talked a lot about dismaturity already, so I won't go over that one, but difficulty following more than one instruction or direction at a time. So we know that falls under learning and memory, that aspect, that primary characteristic category in the neurobehavioral model. So we expect at a certain age that a child should be able to follow 2, 3, 4, even 5-step directions that we've provided to them, especially if it's the same directions day after day. So again, you think about a morning routine and you have it set up so that your house runs the same way every morning, very predictable, same schedule. And you expect your child to be able to understand those 3 to 5 steps that they need to do to get ready and get out the door in time. If they don't, if they aren't able to do those 3 to 5 step directions, but we see it as they're unwilling to, they just don't want to, then we say they're irresponsible, they just don't care, they don't want to follow instructions. And what we have underlying that is fear, right? We feel like we're losing control. We have fear of like, if this now, then what about 10 years from now? What will that look like? We're very angry. It's incredibly frustrating, right? If we're late for work every single day with this routine. So what do we do in those moments when we're having that visceral knee-jerk reaction to that secondary behavior and we're not understanding that our child needs more help, that they can only follow one instruction at a time, et cetera, et cetera? We talk to them or lecture them. We try to reason with them. Maybe we bribe them. We threaten them with consequences, or we shame them. And when that happens, we become more angry. We don't feel good about ourselves. Our child becomes more angry, right? That's increasing that poorness of fit, that pain and discomfort they're feeling from being misunderstood. And oftentimes we're in denial about it all. So what can we do? Recognize brain dysfunction. Sounds so easy, I know, but as you know, we've talked about so far in this webinar tonight, it's not as easy as it seems. It takes a lot of practice. It's a steep learning curve. So understanding that yes, the key is recognizing brain dysfunction and giving yourself some grace when you don't always recognize it. And keeping it simple and keeping it concrete, having visual reminders, giving them the one step at a time. All of those things help. So I'll move down to slow processing pace. So we expect that kids, neurotypical children, learn fast and think fast, right? I've made that assumption about all of you listening to this webinar, that as I'm talking, I'm hopefully not going too quickly, but as I'm talking, you're able to understand what I'm saying at the rate at which I'm saying it. You're able to think about what it means about your own life, about your own child, right? That you're learning fast and you're thinking fast. When we have a child who is a 10-second child in a 1-second world, even when we understand that about them, there are many times where we do not give them even close to the amount of time that they need to process information. Again, no shame, no blame. It is because we are human. And this neurobehavioral model causes us to make such a drastic shift in the way that we think about our kids, is that it takes practice. We need to be retaught, right? So we think of our kids when it's like they're not listening to us. That's our interpretation, that they're not trying, that they're doing it on purpose. They're doing it at me, right? They're ignoring me. They just don't want to do it. All those sorts of things. We become angry. We become frustrated. So usually what we do when we're having that value clash and we're not taking a step back, we speed up our speech. We talk louder. Sometimes we embarrass our children, and I put that under the heading of shame as well. Never a conscious intention that any of us want to make, but sometimes that's what happens. We become shut down. Our child becomes shut down. There's avoidance, there's withdrawal. Oftentimes I call it the deer in the headlight looks, where our child looks at us like, I'm not sure what just happened. They know they're in trouble, but they really don't have any reason why. And the reason for that is because their behavior wasn't intentional, right? It's about their brain working differently. And now they're in trouble and they're very confused as to why that is. So slowing down, right? Again, sounds so easy. It's difficult to practice, but it does become easier with practice. Slowing down and using rich language to help illustrate, but taking more time. So one of the things that we hear sometimes with kiddos who have slow processing pace is use fewer words. And I have a little bit of problem with that, because we don't want to deprive our kids of the rich language that they need to help build their own language and their own vocabulary. But we need to slow down. We need to make more time and more space in terms of giving them that rich language. We need to be able to provide them with the context of the situation, all those obvious kind of contextual clues that they probably much of the time are missing. So again, you'll get copies of the slides. They'll be available to you, and you can come back to this slide if you would like, but just want to make sure that folks know that there's almost every primary characteristic within the neurobehavioral model has the potential of having a clash with one of our values and our deeply held beliefs. And again, that's what makes this parenting journey unique and makes it difficult, challenging, and takes a lot of practice. So self-regulation. I think we probably are all familiar with, in general, what this means. There's a lot of talk about our kids' self-regulation and their inability or their trouble, their difficulty with regulating themselves. But it happens to us too. It's not just limited to individuals who have brain differences. For them, it's much harder, right? But even this whole neurodiverse spectrum, it's a spectrum. And so our kiddos have difficulty with brain tasks, and they have it, it's more intense for them. It becomes up more frequently. It's constantly tripping them up in their day. It doesn't mean that we don't sometimes have some difficulty with the same brain task. It usually is not permanent. It's usually based on sleep or diet or something like that happening, or the circumstance at hand. And then we recover and we rebound into that, what people would consider neurotypical range of that neurodiversity. For our kiddos, of course, that doesn't happen. So self-regulation is no different. It's an executive functioning skill that we all have challenges with at one time or another. And when we talk about the human aspects of this parenting journey, self-regulation is a huge piece for us to be aware of. To parent a child who has challenging behaviors and to constantly be putting that in this new frame of reference takes a lot of emotional energy, and it depends on our ability to keep our emotions in check. So when our nervous system is working well, our brake, like the brake and the accelerator of our emotions, are in balance, right? One doesn't overtake the other. That's when self-regulation is working very well. So surprise, excitement, or even stress, good or bad stress, that's our accelerator. And our brake helps us calm down and relax, right? And so in the face of danger, we will completely shut down and collapse. That's not our brake working well, that's our brake overtaking. When it's working in harmony, the accelerator and the brake, both of those are in check, and our body, our nervous system is doing a good job of keeping us well in that regard. So when we have our children, us, any individual, when any individual has experienced trauma, the ability to self-regulate and keep ourselves in check becomes that much more difficult. When I talk about the toll of caregiver trauma, I actually have a blog post with that title. I don't use that word trauma lightly. I do think that trauma gets overused in many settings in our world today, but this is not one of them. When we are parenting a child that has incredibly challenging behaviors, especially if they are explosive, rage, aggressive, that can be a traumatic experience for us as parents. The impact of that can be quite profound. We talked about some of that in the first webinar, a lot of that in the first webinar. But self-regulation is one of the pieces that becomes more difficult for us when we have experienced a traumatic event or have this continuous level of trauma in our life, making it more important for us to be aware of it and doing the things that we need to do to keep it in check. So trauma is an event, usually not an ordinary one, that harms the body, self, or spirit. It's the result of extraordinarily stressful events that shatter your sense of security, making you feel helpless, making you feel vulnerable. So I know that many, probably the majority, if not all of the parents that I've worked with over the years have felt this sense of trauma at one point or another in their parenting journey. So you're not alone in that. And also the importance of recognizing it for what it is so that you know how to keep that regulation in check, take care of yourself so that you can make it through these human elements of this neurobehavioral parenting journey is that much more important. So some of the symptoms of trauma, feelings of helplessness, intrusive thoughts, anxiety or fear that are to the point where they're disabling, depression or hypervigilance. If you have a child whose secondary behaviors are such that there's safety concerns where you need to be hypervigilant all the time, where they can't be left alone, the supervision needs that they have are quite high or constant, that hypervigilance can come into play. They are made worse by a lack of sleep, by the trauma experienced by the medical or social service system that we've had to engage with to be an advocate for our child and get them services. I've had many parents traumatized by the school experience, interacting with the schools, not having their child be understood at all by the school system, and having to work tirelessly to help create that understanding. And then also the isolation. And so I mentioned, I think in the first webinar, that I run virtual support groups for parents of kiddos with FASD. And the reason for that is that isolation is so profound and so great that it makes this parenting journey even much more difficult when you feel like you're the only one in it, right? When you understand that others are living your same parenting experience, it can help alleviate some of that heaviness that we feel, that again, I feel is part of this human experience, human aspect of this neurobehavioral parenting journey. So I mentioned that the self-regulation and trauma go hand in hand. One of the things that I want to make sure folks really think about is that our history matters. And so none of us came into this parenting experience as adult without our own personal histories. And some of those histories, unfortunately, have involved other traumas, right? Other stressful events. If that's the case for you, I want you to, I encourage you to honor that and understand the importance of that and get support around what does that mean and how does it impact, how does it intensify these human elements of this parenting experience. It's really important to understand that. Self-regulation is something we develop as infant toddlers through that repeated co-regulation with a regulated, I should say regulated adult. So really important there that it's a regulated adult that helps us develop that. At all ages, we need others to help us co-regulate our most intense emotions. We are all wired for connection. It is a biological imperative. We cannot do this alone when we have so many intense emotions associated with our parenting experience. Even as very healthy, regulated adults, we need to have someone to help us co-regulate those most intense emotions. So who is that person for you, right? And do they understand that they're that person for you? And do they understand that because there are these unique aspects of this parenting journey for you, that that may be something that you need more frequently? For example, if it's a partner, if you're in a parenting partnership, it may look different then, right, than a typical parenting partnership. When we experience the emotional pain, our only goal of our body is to seek safety. And if we don't have relationships where we can find this, then that accelerator is going to really rev up, right? The brake is not working as well for us. So we need that relationships, those safe relationships where we can get our co-regulation and be able to kind of come down from that accelerator experience so that we can help our children come down from their accelerator experience and be with them in those really tough moments. So when we have solid self-regulation, our window of tolerance is like this. And so stress and adversity or whatever it might be maybe stretches us a little, but we don't totally flip our lid, right? We have a pretty wide tolerance, a really healthy width to our frustration tolerance. But when we are under constant stress, this window becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the smallest stressors can completely knock us out of our safe zone. Our thinking brain goes offline. We're not as well equipped to make good decisions in those moments. So again, knowing that you have someone that can help you kind of come down from that accelerator, help you use that brake to get co-regulated, to be in connection with them, which requires you to get out of the isolated experience, right, if that's what you feel. Really, really important so that we can, day after day after day, handle the stress that is involved in parenting our children in the way that we want to. So do you hyperactivate or do you deactivate? What happens? And what I mean by that is, we talk about offloading emotion and what happens when we have this really strong emotional response. Do you kind of come out swinging, right? Are you that accelerator full? Or do you deactivate? Do you slowly shut down and isolate and that sort of thing? When does this happen? And how do you know this, right? Is it in those moments when your child gets really amped up and dysregulated and they're being very aggressive and loud, do you shut down? Is that when you shut down? Or do you go right with them, right? Do you get loud with them and then it's just up the ante and spirals completely out of control? Understanding that, taking the time to understand that is critically important so that you can do things differently. So solving problems. And the reason why I mentioned solving problems is a very, very complicated brain task. Everything that's involved in solving problems is really difficult for our kids. Even understanding that there's a problem, identifying it, brainstorming solutions, holding those possible solutions in juxtaposition to each other at the same time and following them out to their conclusion. I mean, it gets very complicated very fast. But for all of us, even if we have the cognitive skills to solve problems, in order to do that, we first must be regulated. We have to be regulated. Once we're regulated and kind of emotionally sound, right, that brake and that accelerator are in balance, then we must be relating and connecting to the person that we're trying to solve the problem with, right? We have to be in tune with them to be able to do that. Only then are we able to reason. So I talked about that window of frustration tolerance. If we are not regulated, then the window of tolerance is going to be really small. If we're not regulated, we're not going to have the ability to connect with the person that we're with, right? And then our thinking brain is offline. We literally are unable to reason. I say the wise owl has flown away. There's no point in trying to reason with our kids in those moments. So again, our values of we're going to settle this problem now. What you did was completely inappropriate. We do not do that in our home, and we're going to talk about it now. We're going to really get to the bottom of why you did what you did, and I want you to know that it was not appropriate. Right? How many of us have done those in that moment when our kids are clearly dysregulated, they're not connected to us. So they have no ability to think about what led to what, tell us their motivation, why they did what they did, experience empathy for our perspective, experience remorse, right? Use their abstract thinking to take on a different perspective and put themselves in our shoes. None of that can happen if they're not emotionally regulated. So again, I talk with parents all the time about this need to circle back. I have a blog post about that process too on my website, to not address these things in the moment because it is a waste of our time and energy, right? Our kids aren't able to cognitively, and to circle back at another time to talk with them about all of those things, right? This is not an excuse for inappropriate behavior, but what it means is that we address inappropriate behavior drastically different than we do neurotypical children. If there was one human element of this parenting experience that is, I think, most difficult for most of the parents I work with, it's this one, right? You have to have this delayed response in terms of addressing behavior. And then once you have, even when you do that, circling back at a later time, it looks different. So I mention all of that to let you know that if it resonates with you, you are not alone. So there are these invisible elements or invisible values, really, of environments that we can often miss that I want to make sure we highlight. So values is one. We've talked a lot about that. Control. So I think that bleeds into values. Is our household a household where there's frequently power struggles, where we're not very flexible in the way that we parent? Is it top down? Do we have a decreasing range of options with our kids? So if you do this again, then this. Oh, if you do it again, then this. If you do it again, then this. Where in a very short amount of time, we don't have any options left, right? We've backed ourselves into a corner, and them as well, and we know that never goes well. Social norms for appropriate behaviors. At this age, you should be acting like this, right? Even sometimes it's not even a conscious thought, but it takes some intentional reflection so that we're aware of what those are. Timelines, the times in which our children should be doing certain things. Expectations, the way we teach our kids, which most of the time we do that with language-based. The art of holding a conversation. I call it the art of holding a conversation because there are so many brain tasks involved in just having a simple back and forth conversation that we sometimes fail to recognize with our kiddos. Grouping by age, and then of course our personal history. I talked a little bit about that, kind of where our values come from. So the sounds of judgment, just like those initial statements that I had on one of the first few slides about some of the things that we say to our kids that are kind of those red flags, like, oh, maybe our values are getting in the way here. These are other ones that I just try to remain aware of these when I'm talking with parents about what's happened or transpired with their kids. And again, it does not mean that these parents who utter these comments about their kids are bad parents or bad people or not doing a good job. They're amazing people who love their children immensely and are working very, very hard to parent them in the best way that they know how. Because we are human, we have these kinds of judgmental thoughts pop up about behaviors that our child demonstrates. Okay? It's very difficult to get away from these. So I want to acknowledge that and let you know that it's because you're human that you think these things at times. And also, if you do, that is such a great opportunity to take that step back and say, okay, what if he's not manipulating me? Just what if? And sometimes it's a stretch. Sometimes it's a stretch for us to go there, right? But I say to parents, well, just what if this isn't true manipulation? What if that's not the intention behind it? What if it has to do with the way his brain works differently? What would you do differently? What would that cause you to do differently that you're not doing already? And what's the worst thing that could happen by you doing that thing, right? Is there going to be any terrible outcome from you treating the behavior as a possible symptom of his disability rather than intentional manipulation? So even just asking that question, what if, can kind of get us to a better mindset, a better place. The sounds of understanding differently. So once we've been working in this neurobehavioral approach parenting paradigm, I think that these sounds of understanding differently start to come to us more frequently and more automatically. It doesn't mean that it's there 100% of the time. I actually think that that's probably impossible because that would be reaching towards perfection, which we know isn't attainable. But I think as you are on that steep learning curve, as it starts to level out ever so slightly, you start to have these thoughts about your child's behavior instead of the more judgmental behavioral-based thoughts. They just don't understand, they forget easily, need to be retaught. It's not personal, it's not on purpose, they're developmentally young for their age, that sort of thing. Self-compassion. So we talked in the first webinar about the importance of resilience and what it is, that the good news is that you have the ability to build your own self-resilience. Each one of us does. It's not an innate quality that either you have or you don't. So that is the good news. And what I said was the kind of bummer news is that you have to do it. Having a supportive village around you certainly helps, but they cannot do it for you. You have to be the one to do it. One of the things that can chip away at your resilience that you've built up faster than anything else is a lack of self-compassion for yourself in this parenting journey. It's incredibly important. So self-compassion is really about acting the same way towards yourself, giving yourself as much grace, as much kindness, understanding, compassion. When you are having a difficult time or you feel like a failure, you notice something that you don't really like about yourself, it involves giving yourself the same amount of compassion as you would someone else in that situation. So instead of just ignoring your pain, and again, the first webinar, we talked a lot about engaging with your emotions and not ignoring it. Instead of ignoring it or having that soldier on mentality, like, you know, so-and-so would be able to do this, I should just buck up, I should do it, it shouldn't be this hard. Instead you stop and you acknowledge, like, yeah, this is really hard. This is really, really hard. And that's why I said at the beginning, that slide, it is as hard as you think it is. It is. And that's why the self-care is important. That's why understanding where you are with your emotional regulation and your nervous system health is important. And your self-compassion for all of that, the heavy load, is important. So honoring and accepting that you are human, right? Especially in very difficult and challenging circumstances or situations. So when I'm talking with parents, and again, I explained that my practice is just working with parents, so not working with families, not working with the kids, only the parents. That's who I support. And much of that support is around this idea of self-compassion, making sure that they understand that anyone in their situation will be feeling and responding in the same way, because this is really, really hard stuff, right? Hopefully trying to help them get rid of some of that shame, because we don't have time for that. We don't have the energy and the emotional capacity for that when we have a child who needs to be parented in a very intense and different way than a neurotypical child. So how to be reflective without beating yourself up. I love this quote from Brene Brown: what we don't need in the midst of struggle is shame for being human. I've talked a lot about that already. Being reflective about what's going on with your internal world in this parenting journey can be really hard work. So it's monitoring your own and others' beliefs, with curiosity. We've talked about that, holding room for lots of possibility about what is informing our mood or our motivation or our actions. So anytime that we are certain of another's intentions, our partner's intentions, our kids' intentions, extended family member, friends, anytime that we are certain of another's intentions, we are not practicing reflective functioning. Brene Brown talks about this being the stories we tell ourselves. And this happens more frequently when we are dysregulated. So when our regulation's not in check because our kids are out of control, then our ability to understand, leave open the possibility of what that behavior could mean is greatly diminished if we don't have the ability to stay regulated in those moments, right? So again, going back to the importance of self-regulation and what that means for us in our nervous system. When we're trying to practice reflective functioning with our children, right, understand their intentions, we're in this kind of relationship spiral with them, it is even a stronger feedback loop than it is with anyone else. So that means that when we're off, when our regulation's off, our kids get off in an even more exaggerated way, right? And then we get off in a more exaggerated way. That's because of the nature of that connection and the nature of that relationship. So again, all the importance of why the care for our nervous system, being able to take self-care practices that help you keep that regulation in check is so important, to being able to really manage all of these human aspects of this neurobehavioral model of our parenting journey. So reflecting on what are those challenging behaviors for you, what are most triggering, and then what can you do to regulate yourself, to slow down your reaction? Have you talked with people around you? If you're in a parenting partnership, have you actually said to them, like, this behavior, I can't handle it. I can't handle it. So that when either one of you is coming up against a behavior that you know is automatically triggering for you, that the other parent can step in and provide support. How can you practice self-compassion in those moments when you lose your cool and don't stay in that neurobehavioral mindset, right? So it's an opportunity to reflect on, well, what didn't go as well as I hoped it would? And how am I going to use this as an opportunity to do it better next time? Because we know that that opportunity will present itself again. But if we don't take that time to really, again, take that step back, reflect on what happened, practice self-compassion in that process, not beat yourself up, so that you can do it better next time, that learning curve is going to continue to be steep, right? It's with that self-reflection and observation that I think it starts to level out. And then how can you circle back with your child to do any repair or reconciliation that may be needed? So we know that because we are human and we're not perfect, We have situations with our children where things didn't go the way that we hoped they would in terms of our relationship with them, maybe the way we reacted to them, the amount of patience that we were able to display at that particular time, particular moment. And so do we circle back to what happened with our kids at a later time to make sure that they understand that, that we want to do things better next time, and also talk with them about what maybe they can do better next time, right? That's where, in those quiet moments where they're regulated and you know that they're able to listen, they don't have all these other cognitive tasks kind of getting in the way of that. Those are the opportunities to talk with them about what led to what, their impact on others in the situation, and also get your whatever you need to say out there as well. So I'll mention it again that I have a blog post on that circling back process on my website if you want to know more about that. So I've talked a lot throughout this webinar already about the importance of observation, but I want to make sure that it's really clear that this is a really active part of the neurobehavioral parenting journey that I think gets neglected. And I don't think it's because people don't see it as important. I think it's because parents who are trying to practice this and implement it are tired and they're overwhelmed and they don't want one more thing that they have to do, right? They're already doing so much. And so when I encourage parents that I work with to keep an observation log, the ones that do talk about it as one of the most helpful, important things for them on this neurobehavioral parenting journey, really figuring out how does this even work in real life, right? How do we take it from concept into actual practice? So taking that step back, depersonalizing, de-escalating, just kind of disengaging, stop the fighting, right? So that you can have the space to observe, learn to see without judging, right? Being curious about those behaviors instead of having our behavioral judgmental lens on them. Seeing the patterns. I always say to parents that I know that the chaos seems random and like there's no patterns, but there's always patterns. It's just that we've not had the opportunity to practice looking for them. And so once you start to observe in a very intentional way, where you're even keeping a log, those patterns start to emerge. And then you can see where the accommodations are needed, right? That's where the proactive piece starts to get much more clear, where you feel like you can actually do something about it. That's identifying the points of that intervention, building on strengths, and then preventing problems, right? And improving our outcomes. So again, of course, the whole point of the neurobehavioral model of parenting is to be able to prevent problems and be proactive to a point where you don't see those secondary behaviors in the same way you have so far. And again, we're not perfect. We don't have control over every environment. So we're going to see those secondary behaviors. I'd be lying if I said they're gone. It's as easy as that, right? No, they aren't, unfortunately. So it's important to know what to do in those moments, like the regulation and all of those things that we've talked about. But with the observation and looking for patterns and seeing kind of doing that really difficult detective work and practicing that, that's where you then have the opportunity to be proactive and really improve your skills in this parenting paradigm, to be more and more proactive, to have as much chance as possible of reducing those secondary behaviors. So the developmental stages of parenting from a neurobehavioral perspective, and this could be of teaching, of understanding, of grandparenting. It's not just for parents, of course. It's understanding from whatever our perspective is, this neurobehavioral approach. So it starts with what I call the dark ages, where there's a lot of confusion and frustration about what's going on with our kids, and we feel a lot of fear, we feel a lot of hopelessness. I actually have a blog post about my experience in those dark ages, if you'd like to read about that. But when we are in those dark ages, we are like, how do I get this child to behave? How do I just get them to stop doing what they're doing, right? That's all I want to do, is extinguish that behavior. That's our whole focus. So we often lecture more, we try to exert more and more control. There's constant power struggles, and there is an incredible amount of fear underlying all of that for us as parents. And then once we start to understand that children do well if they can, right? That they don't want to be in trouble all the time. They don't want to be in this constant conflict with us. We have a little more information and knowledge about that. Then oftentimes we move to what technique will help this person to stop it. So it's very based in behavior modification, rewards, bribery, and that can very easily lead us down this path of, well, nothing works, right? This feeling, again, going back into that hopelessness, because we're still looking at it, even though we have a little more information and knowledge, we're still looking at it through that behavioral lens. From there, once we learn more about this neurobehavioral approach, we start to link the brains with behaviors. These are these light bulb moments where we're like, oh my gosh, this totally makes sense to me. This is my child. This resonates with me. We're starting to ask the question, who is this person, right? How does their brain work differently as opposed to other individuals with neurobehavioral conditions? What are their strengths? How can I build upon those? Where are they having difficulty, and what is the fit? Is it poor? Is it good? What's going on? So we start to see the behaviors as symptoms. We recognize the brain involvement, right? So we're getting there. But alongside of this, again, looking at this from the human elements of this parenting experience, we're learning information about the neurobehavioral model. It's starting to click. And also what that also means is the reality of the permanency of this disability starts to set in even more, right? And that's something that we've really got to grapple with at the same time as we're trying to move forward in our neurobehavioral approach. The other piece of this, I was going to say one other piece that I just lost it. Oh, the other piece about this, I think when we start to see the brain behavior connection more clearly, we have a lot of remorse and regret about what we didn't know and what we didn't do. Another huge aspect, human aspect of this parenting journey that I don't think we talk enough about, right? So we're filled with hope. We understand our child has this disability of the brain, what that means behaviorally. And also we're like, oh, all the things I didn't understand, all of the things that I punished them for. And we just have this weight and this heaviness of guilt, right? So understanding that's unique, that's because we're human, and how can you get support to work through that so that you can continue to move into this understanding and acceptance. What accommodations are going to be a good fit? Who else needs this information? So you're getting more clear. Again, you've been on the steep learning curve. Maybe it's starting to level out a little bit. You have less confusion about what it means. The dreams that you had for your child are rewritten. You still hold dreams and aspirations for them, but they just look different, right? Based on what you know. And many times this is where parents start to see a new relationship with their child emerge, right? A reconnection, a better connection because of that understanding and acceptance of them. And then relationship and accommodations. What needs to be in place to assure seamless accommodations in all systems? So you've gone from this understanding what it means for yourself in your parenting journey, maybe in your family unit, in your home, moving to how do I advocate for all environments for my child? And what does that mean? You really understand the bigger picture. You can translate this neurobehavioral approach to other settings to help create understanding and acceptance in other settings. So I wanted to be able to show this just to illustrate that there are stages in this parenting journey, right? Nobody should expect themselves to go from education, oh, went to this training, learned what it was, let's go home and let's do it perfectly. Totally unrealistic, right? There are these developmental stages that I see time and time again that every parent has to go through in order to get to that place where they feel like, okay, now I've got it. It's not perfect because we are not perfect people, but I've got it to a point where I feel confident and I feel good about my knowledge and my ability to parent in this way. All right. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope that it's helpful. I hope that it gives you some perspective in terms of, well, like I've been saying the whole time we've been together, that there are some very unique and profound human elements of this parenting journey that you just don't experience when you're in that typical parenting experience. And if we don't recognize those and we don't understand the full weight of those and give ourselves some grace and some care, then we will not be able to do the job that we all want to do, right? So I hope that this has given you some things to think about in your own parenting journey and ways that you can hopefully better recognize and then manage those human elements that kind of trip us up or get in our way of moving forward on this neurobehavioral parenting approach. So there's my information, my website. I know that I mentioned several times that I have blog posts there. I write them with the parents that I work with in mind, so they're all topics that are relevant to the parenting experience, parenting a child with FASD. I would encourage you to check them out. Clients have also told me that they're very helpful in passing on to family members or those that they want to help create more understanding of. So please feel free to use that in that way, use them in that way if that's helpful to you. I also have a newsletter that I send out once a month with resources for parents, any new blog posts I've written, trainings, that kind of thing. You can sign up for that on my website if you'd like to do that. I'm also on Facebook and Instagram, so, and post new stuff there all the time. If you want more information on the neurobehavioral parenting approach, I would encourage you to order Trying Differently Rather Than Harder by Diane Malbin. She was the former director and founder of Facets, but you can order that book by just going to facets.org and they would gladly send you a copy. All right, thank you so much, and I wish you all well on your parenting journey. Be kind to yourself in that process. I hope to see you all on the Q&A that we will have for the third webinar for this series. Thank you and take care.